An adventurer's life is never one of ease. This is Sega Masters. The Master System has not had a good start to 1989 to say the least, kicking the year off with 3 mediocre Sega-developed games Activision distributed for them in the US, while being quietly laid to rest by the company itself in its native Japan. Yet the spring months seemingly offered a brief ray of hope for Sega's 8-bit console as it soldiered on in the Western market, with a mixture of original titles and pre-1989 carts for the Mark III finally getting American releases. We kick off our look at that lineup with one of the latter, Ys the Vanished Omens. Indeed, a Sega-developed conversion of the action role-playing computer title from Nihon Falcom that was originally known as Ancient Ys Vanished Omens, and enjoys a sizable following in Japan as well as being a cult favorite elsewhere. While Nintendo gets most of the credit for molding the 1980s video game market in the West, whether it's deserved or not, it's easy to forget Sega was contributing some innovations of its own when it wasn't relying on arcade ports. For example, it was Sega who introduced North American gamers to the world of traditional console role-playing games with the releases of Miracle Warriors and Phantasy Star in the fall of 1988, almost a year before the first RPGs would arrive on the NES outside of Japan. Now in March of 1989 we find Sega dipping back into the RPG well, only this time they're helping a popular fantasy title in the land of the rising sun take its first steps into the Western market, again before Nintendo would do the same for Dragon Warrior and later Final Fantasy. Created by Masaya Hashimoto and Tomoyoshi Miyazaki for Falcom, Ys made its debut on NEC's PC-88 computer in Japan in June of 1987. It was basically a follow-up to the company's earlier hit Dragon Slayer, which many have claimed to be the prototype of the action RPG genre. Unlike many of its PC contemporaries on both sides of the Pacific, Ys was intended to be something of an entry-level role-playing adventure that featured fast-paced arcade-style action with traditional role-playing mechanics sprinkled in, while cutting back on some of the tediousness typically found in computer quests. In short, it was made for adventurers who'd rather play The Legend of Zelda instead of Ultima. Ys was successful enough to be followed by 8 main sequels and a few side titles, while being ported to just about every Japanese console and computer platform under the sun at the time, from the MSX to the Famicom. It would also see a number of remakes and reissues over the following years, though many of these were Japan only until recently. Sega ensured their console was not left out as they snagged a license to develop and release support for the Mark III in October 1988 that was mostly faithful to the original, outside of a few tweaks. It would eventually become the first conversion of Ys to be released outside of Japan, appearing in the US and eventually making its way to Europe a few months later. The series centers around the exploits of Adol Christian, a young red-haired swordsman who constantly thirsts for adventure and all that. This first chapter of the saga finds Adol sailing through the sea somewhere when he runs into a magical storm wall that's acting as a barrier surrounding a mysterious island. Caught in the tempest, Adol is shipwrecked and washed ashore the land of Asteria, thus setting the stage for this role-playing adventure. The Master System version opens with Adol, or Aaron as he's known in this translation for whatever reason, wandering into the town of Minia hoping to find out more about the land and what's been going on. This port skips any sort of intro and goes right into the action, though the game's backstory is further detailed in the manual for those curious. As Aaron converses with the townsfolk milling about, many of whom naturally respond in ye olde English, he learns that Asteria was once known for its fine silver but is now plagued by evil beings and other unfortunate happenings, including thieves supposedly running amok. Many of the citizens will even talk about some misfortune that's befallen them, all but asking you for a favor. There are of course the standard amenities found in most other RPG villages, like a selection of shops, a hospital that sells healing items, and even a tavern where you can meet with a few of the locals hanging out inside to get more information, as well as more possible objectives. You do need to keep in mind that Sega's cart is one of the earlier conversions of Ys and a no-frills port of the computer original at that, and as we'll see throughout this video, time hasn't exactly been kind to it. The person Aaron really needs to meet with is Sarah the Town Seer, who will give you your main objective, but only after you somehow obtain a weapon, shield, and armor. It just so happens that Aaron begins this quest with 1,000 gold pieces already in his pocket, allowing you to purchase some of his equipment right away at the nearby weapon and armor shops, both of which have a scant selection of gear for you. There might be a few ways to finagle even more gold for your needs if you look hard enough. Just be aware you do need to actually go into the submenu and manually equip your newly acquired arms for them to be of any use on your journey. Once properly outfitted, Aaron learns from Sarah about the ancient kingdom of Ys, as well as the goddesses who saved the land from darkness in the past. Their exploits are allegedly documented in 6 long-lost magical books, which can grant great power to whoever unites all the volumes together. Aaron determines that combined power of the books of Ys is the key to saving Asteria and decides to take up the challenge, receiving this crystal to get started as well as an experience boost. You'll quickly find you may not be alone in your quest. Rumors are floating around about a supposedly wicked man in a black cloak roaming in the land, possibly looking for the books to use their power for evil purposes, so you obviously need to find them first. Your search begins in earnest once you depart the village, and this is, of course, a 1980s RPG. Thus, you need to build up your strength and earn money to eventually upgrade your equipment by slaying the hostile creatures roaming the countryside for experience points and gold. As I touched on earlier, the cart's unique combat system relies on real-time action instead of randomly flipping to a separate screen for a turn-based battle with monsters, yet there is no dedicated button to unleash your sword. Instead, Aaron slays his enemies by simply ramming into them enough times to drain their hit points until they expire. That's basically it, just bumping right into them. And this up-close combat is your only attack method since no ranged secondary weapons or magic spells are found in this realm. This unusual method of beating monsters does give Ys a nice brisk feel that doesn't get bogged down by endless menu-based encounters. And you only really need to use the buttons on the controller to access the submenu and manipulate a few objects at certain points. Obviously you can only take a certain amount of hits yourself until you perish, but amazingly enough you have the ability to regenerate your health in the outdoor areas by just standing still. Some frustrating deaths in the early going are possible due to a few quirks with the so-called bump system, including the need to attack these beasties from either the sides or from behind. Attempting to take them head-on will more than likely deplete your health rapidly. It doesn't help that the creatures you tangle with change directions constantly, often resulting in you getting killed before you even realize it. Fortunately, you do have the ability to save your progress at any time and place, with 5 save slots available, and you'll be grateful for the quick restarts. One thing you'll notice in the early going is how nice this game looks. Once again, a Sega cart provides some vibrantly colored environments which are nothing special or eye-popping, but mostly well defined. Everything moves and scrolls smoothly as you travel about the landscape, and many of the sprites boast some solid details in spite of their rather small size. You're also treated to some well-done portraits when you enter certain buildings to visit the inhabitants. However, the game's opening minutes may give you a false impression of offering a large realm to explore when it's really the opposite. The world of Ys is actually rather tiny, with only the 2 towns to visit and just 3 multi-level dungeons to explore, the third of which takes up nearly half the playtime of this quest. And the shops back in Minia with their scant selections are the only places to purchase items in the entire game. This journey ends up being a somewhat short one as a result, which may disappoint adventurers used to large, world-spanning quests such as Dragon Warrior, yet at the same time it resorts to some padding to compensate for the seeming lack of content. For starters, many foes are impervious to your blows until you reach certain experience levels, so you need to concentrate on the weaker creeps until you're strong enough for the heavy hitters. Trouble is, the lesser baddies often drop very little experience and gold for your trouble, forcing you to spend excessive chunks of time farming untold numbers of them to slowly accumulate the necessary points until you finally boost your stats enough to handle the tougher foes. And that's if you can even find any baddies to knock off. Despite the land supposedly being besieged by monsters, enemies are often scarce and it can take up to a good minute or 2 to hunt a single creature down. This artificially extended grinding can try the patience of most questers eager to move on to the next phase of their journey. Here we have one of the few dungeons Ys offers for you to explore, though you'll need to obtain a special item to actually enter it. That said, the palace initially seems deserted, as the only thing you find among the first set of corridors and rooms are a pair of chests that each require a key to open. Those who are familiar with the dungeons and other versions of Ys will find that Sega flipped the layouts for their port, again for unknown reasons. It isn't long before you run into the first of several bosses that cross your path throughout the game and need to be conquered to proceed. Unfortunately, the boss fights are more aggravating than exciting, as you again need to be at certain experience levels to even bruise them. On top of having to bump right into them to do damage, with no ability to keep your distance, these guardians often have defenses and other techniques that make it difficult to get in close enough to land any hits without taking much damage yourself. Granted, this was supposed to force you to use some strategy, but having to constantly wait for your openings can cause these confrontations to drag on far longer than necessary. Oddly enough, after advancing another level or two through more grinding, you often end up being almost too overpowered for the bosses and can easily best them, sometimes even without breaking a sweat. The dungeons themselves aren't really anything special, just making your way through the twisting corridors and multiple floors looking for the important artifacts you need for your mission, while fending off the monsters that prowl the halls, as well as solving an occasional puzzle or overcoming some obstacle on your way to the goal. The palace in particular isn't terribly difficult to navigate from start to finish, though one annoyance is how it's often hard to see doorways that lead southward, meaning you might miss which way to proceed and end up going in circles needlessly. There's one hidden doorway in particular that's revealed only by using a certain item in a specific place, yet you get no clues on where that spot is, leaving you to somehow stumble upon it on your own. Then there's the mine, which is significantly more difficult than the palace due to the limited visibility you're saddled with. Makes it hard to see the already strong monsters that are hiding in the shadows approaching you, giving them the chance to ambush you before you can react in time. And the already tight quarters make surviving these battles all the more tougher. It doesn't help that Aaron's self-healing ability doesn't work in any of the dungeons by itself, so you better hope you have a potion on hand to restore your health when needed. Also, you can easily find yourself hopelessly lost in the twisting corridors and unable to find your way back if you don't have good maps or a walkthrough handy. Among the treasures you can find in the labyrinths are the rings, each of which can endow you with a different bonus such as stronger attack power or defense, slowing enemy movements, and even allowing you to regenerate your health in the dungeons when you normally wouldn't be able to do so, adding a nice bit of tactical strategy to the standard action. On the other hand, many of the artifacts you find are either good for only one use at certain points and then forgotten about, or just need to be returned to their rightful owner so you can swap it for the next supposedly important item. You also don't have any sort of storyline to keep you motivated in your journey, in spite of the series' reputation of epic storytelling. Obviously, you shouldn't expect any of the long, soap opera-esque narratives typical of modern RPGs in a 1980s cartridge, but still the mostly light plot barely gets touched on outside of the brief conversations Aaron engages in with the people he visits. The only person you need to speak to more than once is Jebba in the cabin, who will help you read the books as you find them. A few possible reveals are teased down the line, but this conversion never follows through on them, especially the girl you rescue from the palace. This cart does try to throw in a few plot twists here and there, including how one of the books of Ys can only be obtained after a tragic event. Overall, the gameplay of Ys as a whole boils down to mostly grinding for strength or treasure hunting in the dungeons, with bits of actual plot advancement thrown in. With only a handful of locations to travel to, you never have to worry about where to go next, yet Aaron is locked into a specific order to visit them which he can't deviate from. You're stuck following the checklist step by step with no chance to mix things up, and there's no additional secrets to discover either, meaning you'll see everything this card has to offer in a short time, even by RPG standards. At least your monster farming and fetch questing is accompanied by a decent soundtrack, as is the case with most versions of Ys. The Sega version's music, composed by future superstar Yuzo Koshiro, does a mostly excellent job setting the tone for each area, from the heroic overworld theme to the spooky tunes for the dungeons and even some decent music for the boss fights. The Western Master System's PSG soundtrack does fall slightly short compared to some of the other conversions of Ys, including the Japanese Mark III version's FM enhanced tunes, but it's still worth playing this game to check out the music. As usual, the few sound effects are just there to do their job and aren't anything memorable nor offensive. Eventually, everything you went through in obtaining the first 3 books of Ys and the silver equipment comes off as merely a build-up to your ultimate destination, the Tower of the Doomed, a menacing 21-floor behemoth that basically acts as the second half of the game. And you're unable to leave once you enter, though odds are you finished all your business in the towns and dungeons and have no further reason to visit them. The object is to navigate your way to the top of the tower floor by floor, while searching for the remaining books and other essential items. Yet this is also where Ys essentially drops the few RPG elements it contained, morphing into something of a basic dungeon crawler. All this sequence requires for the most part is wandering through hallways and searching various rooms for treasure chests on each floor, before going up the stairs to the next floor to do the same thing again. And the path through the tower is mostly straightforward for the bulk of your mission, even with a bit of backtracking involved. Aaron is already maxed out in experience by this point with a good chunk of the quest still ahead of him, making you wonder why you still have to bother fighting monsters if you gain nothing from killing them. You'll be wishing you could just bypass them and save your energy for the bosses, who aren't really that difficult to take down. With no more shops to buy anything, gold is just about meaningless as well, though the best equipment is found within the tower anyway. You're not quite alone in the tower either. A few allies have also somehow made their way into this labyrinth, and you'll be running into them on multiple occasions as they try to help you along your mission. On a side note, this is where we meet Dogi, who will become Eido's BFF in future entries of the series. Reaching the top of the tower will take a good hour or so, and being confined to one environment for that long with little visual diversity between floors can cause the sequence to look and feel repetitive before too long, despite a few puzzles to solve and boss fights thrown in that help briefly break up the monotony. On top of that, you need to make sure you're not neglecting an essential item by the time you arrive at the doorstep of the endgame, or else you're in for quite a bit of retracing your steps to find what you missed. Trudging through this gauntlet does culminate in a well-done final confrontation with the game's big bad, Dark Decked, the black-cloaked man you've heard about a few times during your journey who has the last book of Ys in his possession. Even then, your reward for conquering Decked in the final battle is a somewhat abrupt ending that leaves a few plot holes unresolved. As it turns out, the initial Ys game ended up being the first half of a 2-part story and concluded on something of a cliffhanger, with the sequel continuing right where the first chapter left off and ultimately tying all the loose ends up, including some of the unanswered questions in Ys 1. One can speculate Sega probably knew they would never get around to porting Ys 2 onto the Master System with other big projects on the horizon, so they just came up with a quick conclusion and called it a day. So what to ultimately make of Ys on the Master System when all is said and done? Sega's conversion does its job in bringing the computer original to their console mostly intact, and certainly offers a different experience from the usual RPG fare that can be fun and exciting at times. But while it was perfectly serviceable for its time, being a straight up port of just the first Ys game means it hasn't aged well with its somewhat short quest and lack of any real sense of exploration. The constant backtracking, excessive mandatory grinding, and extended tower exploration comes off as padding for an adventure that can be completed in just around 5 hours, in spite of its rather unbalanced difficulty level. And once you do beat Ys, you have no reason to play it again, as the strict path you're forced to follow leaves you no opportunity at special challenges or the like to shake things up. It's of course hard to ignore how this cart falters in comparison to all the remakes and reissues of Ys that have appeared over the following years, most of which bundled the first 2 games together to ensure consumers weren't left with only half the overall story. Much like we saw with R-Type a few episodes back, Sega's port would be rendered all but obsolete after just a year on the US market by NEC, with the release of the still excellent Ys Books 1 and 2 on the TurboGrafx 16. NEC's CD-ROM version combines Part 1 and Part 2 into one long seamless adventure while adding many enhancements and improvements to both the gameplay and presentation, including a more fleshed out story, and it's still held in high regard by fans of the series. For the longest time, most of the other remakes stayed in Japan, Yet that has changed in recent years with enhanced versions of Ys appearing on some of the more mainstream platforms in the West, such as the PlayStation Vita, Nintendo DS, and even PCs, giving more North American gamers the chance to see what they missed and making Sega's antiquated version an even harder sell. In the end, whether Ys on the Master System really warrants a recommendation depends on what you're looking for. It's a decent choice for console role-playing fans looking for a different adventure to tackle, if you can ignore its shortcomings, but with so much of its luster lost over the years, it's not quite the shining jewel it once was and doesn't quite live up to its reputation.